we're questioning it's people's own ethics.
Right.
Like, can you live with treating someone that way? I mean, somebody watches I agree with you 100%, Barbara. It's policy. We have to set that in, just like a small business, there's policies that, govern how an employer treats an employee. I think we're looking at ethics. How can you treat a person that's taking care of your children? I mean, I know lots of people that take care of their nannies really well. They put them through school, they take care of their, so
Right.
I mean, it's
that's very important.
But doesn't it work both ways? Won't the policy, there should be a policy that protects both sides of the coin?
It would
if
if workers...
You have obligations to fulfill and...
Yes, of course. And clearly, just like any employment situation, when people work for whatever industry you work for or your own business, when you take care of the people who work for you, there's a maximum benefit to all involved. And so we're talking about safety issues, we're talking about rights of individuals who are not objects, how often do you hear, because of work situations, I'm not going to be home, I'm supposed to be home at 6, but I can't be home until 8. How often does that happen in some families? And what about the obligation of that person who can't stay later? There's no protection. They're not going to leave your children, and they're not paid overtime in most situations. So some of the bill, if it's passed in New York State, will address that. And certainly we know from past political campaigns, if any one of you are going to run for office, you better be paying your Social Security and taking
Zoe Beard.
Otherwise, we know a lot of great candidates that lost their opportunity.
Carolyn Kennedy, Zoe Beard.
Exactly.
And I also wonder too, again, we're talking about nannies and our perception of what they're worth, essentially, when you're in these relationships. Many of these relationships I see are mixed race. We have many women from the Caribbean taking care of white children. We have, I think, Barbara, you had mentioned before the show started that there's this new trend towards women from Nepal being hired as nannies. Would you kind of share a little bit of that with us? And
just this week I visited a younger friend who has a new child, and we were in a local park in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and she pointed out to me that there's a wide population, a fairly significant number of young families hiring women from Tibet. And as we entered into the park, she pointed out that, and this is true in many playgrounds in the city, not exclusive to this neighborhood park in Brooklyn, where the stay-at-home moms are with their children and the women who are caring for other people's children stay pretty much segregated. Never the twain shall meet, if you will. And there was a large group of women who she said she knew some of them, and they were all from Tibet. And I've heard this, that there are populations that become sort of, if you will, with all due respect, the hip family, hip nanny
that's
situation.
what you do if you're right, exactly.
And then so then we enter into the discussion of how are people entering the country? What are their rights as undocumented workers if they're undocumented? What are their protections? Maybe they're not going to complain that consistently they're working 60 and 70-hour weeks because the threat of being deported becomes real. So it's not an equal relationship. Not that one has to say it has to be. We're creating sides here.
Barbara, remember that a lot of the undocumented workers want to work off the books as well.
Yes, of course.
So that's also part of it, because some of them, I know one particular situation where that very, very close friend of mine that actually comes from Dominican Republic, and she specifically she's worked for over 20 years. She only wanted cash, so you could say everybody was playing a role in it. In the meantime, she had a beautiful home in Dominican Republic, and she was getting welfare and food stamps and doing all that. So she was playing the same game in a certain sense, and she says, I'll only take the job if you pay me cash. So so you could say, well, we shouldn't hire them. So maybe that's where the law comes in, that you need the law in order not to protect everybody around the table.
Well, obviously it worked for your friend as well. Clearly, obviously it worked for your friend as well to have a relationship
I agree, but that's a lot
for
of
20 years.
Right.
And there are many Americans, documented Americans, who work off the buck. So I don't think it's an issue of people who only come from other countries who choose to have a financial relationship with their employer.
I agree with you.
Whether I support that is not the question. The question is what's fair. And I think the stress that many immigrants in our country who are huge contributors to the economy in the United States face many struggling issues around how things are in the climate that things are in now. And I think that's added to whether or not people feel safe whether to go to an employer. First of all, the unemployment situation and the recession has created tremendous stress on people to stay in situations that aren't
we'll have
safe.
to wrap shortly, but I have an example of a friend of mine who's from Grenada. She works for an elderly gentleman. He gives her room and board, no money. Help.
Wow,
These
that's
are
amazing.
happening all over
All
Brooklyn.
over,
Right,
exactly.
So,
that's
you know,
common.
I tend to feel that our nannies are
That's-
exploited. Yes, there may be instances where you may feel exploited,
I think
but the power
domestic
is with
workers
the
as a
domestic.
class of
They're
workers are
powerless. They're
exploited.
powerless.
No question.
Yes.
No question.
But-
And that's why we need policies in place nationally.
Policies
are
Absolutely.
good.
Workplace.
Excellent.